The views expressed on Science for the People are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
This week on Science for the People, we are looking at why ants seem to act much smarter in groups than on their own, and how we can study their swarm intelligence using robots. We'll be speaking with Stephen Pratt, Associate Professor in the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University, about how ants in a colony work together to look for things they need, like nest sites and food. Then we'll speak with Simon Garnier, Assistant Professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at the New Jersey Institute of Technology, about ants that can make living structures out of their own bodies. Welcome to Science for the People. I'm Anika Hazra. With me today is Stephen Pratt, Associate Professor in the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University. Stephen, welcome to Science for the People.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so tell me about the kind of research that's conducted in your lab.
Well, my lab is mainly interested in understanding how ant colonies and bee colonies are able to act as a highly organized collective intelligence. So we spend a lot of time giving colonies of ants challenges like making decisions about where to live or what to eat, and then seeing how well they can meet these challenges, and then trying to figure out what are the specific behaviors that they use that allow them to act very intelligently as a group, even though they don't have any kind of well-informed central leaders or hierarchical structure that we might expect to see, for example, in a human society.
Okay, so can you explain in a little more detail what does decentralized organization mean?
Yes, so, if you think about human organizations, of course, vary a great deal, but normally we think of them as being something that is structured around some kind of hierarchy, where there are specialists who are essentially managers who gather data, make decisions, and then issue instructions to the remaining members of the organization. Ants don't do anything like that. There's nobody in charge. There's no sort of leader or manager. There's no one ant that you could sort of, imagine asking, what's the colony up to today? What kinds of food sources are you evaluating today? And how many workers are you going to send to this food source or that food source? There's nobody who has that kind of information. Instead, they do these very complex behaviors, especially, making collective decisions, even though there isn't any single ant who's gathered information about all the options and compared them and then figure out which one is the best one. So it's decentralized in that sense that really no one is in charge. Of course, most people know that ant colonies have an individual called the queen, but the queen is not in any way a leader. Her role is very important. She has a distinctive role because she is the egg layer, the reproductive, the mother of all the other members of the society. But she's not really their boss. She doesn't know what's going on and tell everybody what to do.
Oh, so she's not responsible for laying instructions or anything to the other workers in the colony?
No, it's really very much worker-driven. Like, for example, to make it more concrete, if you give a colony, say, a choice between two feeders, and they both have sugar water, which ants like very much, and one of them may be a stronger solution, sweeter than the other one, the colony will figure that out. It'll learn which one is the better one, and then it will allocate its workforce so that most of the foragers go to the better food source and not to the worst one. And then if you later switch the quality, they'll change their allocation and then move their foragers over to the newly improved food source. And they do that even though if you follow individual ants, you're not going to find that there's any ant who visited both and then figured out which one was the best and then told the other ants where to go. Nor is there any, it's not the case that there's some boss ant back at the nest who communicates with foragers coming from the two sites and figures out by communicating with them which one is the best. There's really nobody who knows, no individual ant who knows which is the best. And yet, the colony as a whole is still able to make that intelligent allocation of labor according to food quality.
So why would this decentralized organization ever evolve? What makes this strategy better than others when it comes to communication?
Yeah, that's a good question because, you can think of it in general in two ways. One way you could say, well, the reason it evolved is just because the ants aren't capable of anything more, right? Mm-hmm. They're just dealing with the constraints of individual performance. Just, how much information can an individual ant process? What capabilities do they have as individuals to organize this kind of thing? And I think that kind of constraint is undoubtedly important. But I think the more interesting way to look at it is to say, given those constraints, what kind of advantages can they get from a decentralized approach? And there's one very clear advantage, I think, is that systems like this, decentralized systems, are very robust to disturbance. So, if you have one ant who plays a key role, like the boss ant, and you remove that ant, or the ant is injured or lost, then the colony is in big trouble, right? The whole decision process falls apart. But if there is no, indispensable ants, pretty much every ant can plays a small role, and you just need a lot of them to have the group function, then you can lose a few ants and everything will still work just fine. So, and ant colonies are very robust in that way, and decentralization is part of the reason that's the case.
All right, so it looks like one of the ant species that you work with specifically is called the crevice-dwelling rock ant. So did you choose this particular species for the reasons you mentioned previously, or is there something special about them?
It's those reasons, plus, as you point out there, these ants live in rock crevices. That was also very appealing about them, because I had become interested in nest site selection, partly through the work of my PhD advisor, Tom Seeley, who is among many people who's done some very interesting pioneering work on how honeybee colonies find a nest site and choose it and move into it and build their colony. As I pointed out, there are some challenges to studying bees. So what I wanted to do was study a more tractable species that does something similar. And what's distinct about these ants, the genus, by the way, is called Temnothorax. So I may just refer to them as Temnothorax as we talk. What's very distinctive about them compared to, better known ants is that they don't dig their own nests in soil. Everybody pictures a sort of anthill where the colonies dig tunnels in the soil. These ants don't do that. What they do is go find a ready-made nest. They go find a crevice in a rock that already exists, and then they simply move in their colony into that crevice, and they may make some small modifications, build some small walls, things like that. But basically, they look for a preformed nest. And that means that they are very dependent on their ability to scour the landscape where they live, find any good candidate nests, compare them, and then figure out which is the best one, and then reach consensus and move into that site. And that's both a very interesting problem and a very hard one to solve. And so I wanted to study these ants to figure out how they do it.
How would you simulate that kind of nest in a lab setting?
Yeah, that's another nice thing about them, actually, because if you think about it, these crevices are literally just, they're like a few millimeters wide, and they might be as large as the palm of your hand. And so it's not that hard to make an artificial version of that out of glass slides and balsa wood. So we'll take a slat of wood, cut a cavity out of the middle of it, sandwich it between the slides, and then maybe either cut an entrance through the side in the wood or drill an entrance hole through the glass. And that actually is a pretty satisfying nest for the ants to live in. And the other thing that's good about that design is we can change the quality of it. We can have larger or smaller entrances. We can make the cavity bigger or smaller. We can change the light level inside. We can change moisture level, all these other things that the ants care about. And that enables us to give them, challenges where we have a bunch of nests of different quality, and we determine how they are able to find the best one.
Are there any difficulties in studying ants in a lab? How difficult is it to get a colony from nature and then move it to a lab, or multiple colonies? Are there any kind of logistical issues you face studying ants in a lab?
Yeah, that sort of challenge varies a lot depending on the species. So there are some, I work in Arizona, and there are many really fascinating, glamorous ant species who live in the desert here and who dig their nests in the ground. But if you want to dig up a colony, say, and bring it into the lab, it's extremely challenging because the soil is very compacted and hard. It's almost like digging in concrete. So even to get a single colony, you might have to, use, a backhoe or some sort of, power equipment. The ants I study, on the other hand, because they don't live in the soil, it's just a question of finding a good habitat where they're abundant, and then going around and looking in rock crevices until you find the ants, a colony living in them. And it's very easy to collect them as well. You just open up the crevice, and we have these little devices called aspirators that we use that basically just vacuum the ants up without harming them, and then we bring them to the lab and house them. And so if you find a good location where the ants are abundant, and you have plenty of eager students to help you, then you can collect something like 50 colonies in the course of a day.
Wow, where do you keep these colonies?
And that's, they live in the lab. We set them up in little boxes living in those crevice nests I described before. The boxes are quite small. They might be just like 4 inches on a side and about an inch high. And we treat the boxes with this substance, this slippery substance that makes the walls hard to climb so the ants can't get out. But you can just imagine a shelf in our lab that might have 20 or 30 or 40 or more of these little boxes, each one with an ant colony living inside it. So we can keep many ant colonies in our lab pretty comfortably.
Are these colonies constantly growing, or do they stop at a certain size?
Yeah, some species of ants, like for example, if I studied fire ants, which are also a very interesting ant, and they are pretty easy to keep in the lab. They're almost too easy to keep in the lab because they grow and grow and grow, and you can have thousands or tens of thousands of ants, very energetic ants that sting and that might get out of their boxes and cause trouble. Again, the Temnothorax ants I study, since the colonies never get very large, that's not really a problem. On the other hand, I wouldn't say that they really thrive in the lab where the colonies grow and keep growing as we keep them. They sort of stabilize, but I think they're never really quite as happy in the lab as they would be out there living back in the forest where we collected them. So although they're healthy, they don't really grow and thrive as much as they would in nature.
Is it difficult to maintain these colonies so they do survive? So what do your ants eat specifically?
Oh, they're very, very easy. In fact, I have a friend Stephen Cover, who knows more about raising ants than anybody on Earth, and he's always described Temnothorax as thriving on neglect. Which is, we try not to neglect them, but they're very, very tough. And so we feed them once a week. We feed them a diet that we make. It's an agar-based diet, so it's kind of like ant jello. It's got eggs in it, honey, some crushed vitamin pills, a few other ingredients. And that keeps them going pretty well. We sometimes supplement that with small insects, say fruit flies, for example, since they're rather omnivorous in nature, so they eat a variety of different things, from nectar to dead insects.
All right, so let's move on to the different kinds of complex social behaviors that colonies exhibit. So can you explain foraging and a nest site selection? How do those two things work?
I'll talk about nest site selection mainly because that's what we learned the most about. And so if you imagine the typical experiment we do is mimics a case in which you imagine a colony living happily in its crevice nest, and then an animal comes by, say, and kicks the crevice and knocks the top off, so suddenly the colony is completely exposed and its home is destroyed. At that point, they need to find a new home, and we can imitate this in the lab just by taking one of our artificial nests and removing the roof and putting the colony in a big sort of tray, maybe a meter across, and then giving them some unoccupied new nests to potentially move into. And as we watch them, what will first happen is there'll be a bit of panicking that goes on, but then the ants will settle down. And then a large number of ants, scout ants, will leave the nest and sort of wander through this tray looking for new homes. Eventually one of them may find one of the new nests we've offered, and she'll enter it, and she'll spend a lot of time in there walking around inside it, antenating it, feeling it with her antennae, coming and going, trips back and forth between that nest and the old nest. And what she seems to be doing is assessing the nest, measuring its qualities, figuring out how good it is. Eventually, if she decides it's good enough, she'll start recruiting nestmates to visit it. And she does this in a very interesting way. It's a behavior that's called a tandem run. Probably most people know that ants lay chemical trails. And you may have seen chemical trails on the sidewalk or in your kitchen, where you have a lot of ants walking in a line from their nest to a food source. Say, the ants we study don't do that. Instead, they have this behavior called tandem running, where the scout ant who's found a nest will personally lead a single fellow nestmate all the way from the old nest to this potential new nest. And it's a very distinctive behavior in which the leader ant emits a chemical signal that attracts the follower, and the follower continuously signals her presence to the leader by touching the leader's abdomen with her antennae. So they have this two-way communication going on that allows them to make it as a pair all the way to that new site. And then the follower who got recruited, when she's arrived there, she can now make her own independent assessment of the site. And she'll do the same thing, run around inside, walk around the edges, measure things like entrance size, cavity size, other features. And again, she may also start to recruit by tandem runs. And as you know, this creates a kind of snowball effect of positive feedback. And over the coming 10, 20 minutes, hour or more, the population of scouts visiting the site will slowly increase through this tandem recruitment. And it turns out that if you follow individually marked ants, we've learned that the probability that an ant will start to do this tandem running, depends on how good the site is. So if you imagine you have two different sites, one of them is better than the other one. The two sites are discovered by completely different scouts, right? Because these scouts don't really communicate with each other that much. But the better site is going to experience a faster growth of population because every ant who encounters it is going to have a higher probability that she starts to do the tandem runs. Okay. The poorer site may also get some tandem runs, but not as many. And so that means you get this different growth of population at the two sites. And that's one of the most important things about how they're able to make a decision, even though they don't have any leader. The second really big thing that we've learned about how they do it is that business of tandem running only goes on for so long. And then they have a sudden change. All the tandem runs stop. And instead, the ants who had been leading tandem runs go back to the old nest and they simply pick up nestmates and carry them all the way to the new nest. And at this point, everything speeds up. When they just carry their nestmates, it's much faster. And so maybe 3 times faster even. So pretty soon, once they reach that threshold and they start transporting instead of tandem running, the colony gets moved very rapidly to the chosen site. And the important rule that we discovered is that an individual ant makes the decision to switch to transport based on a quorum rule. So basically, she's monitoring how many ants have already arrived at the site she's recruiting to, and once it hits a threshold, that's when she does the switch. And that's very important for their ability to make a collective choice, because once that happens at one site, and it's probably going to be the better site where it happens first, then really rapidly the whole colony gets moved there. And that therefore makes it less likely that the colony will have like an undesirable outcome, like say, the colony splits. You might imagine a case where you get a quorum at 2 sites and the colony, you get ants being transported to 2 sites and the colony is split. That's bad news. But the way they do it makes that less likely to happen.
So with the tandem running, is it only ever one ant following one leader ant?
It is almost always only one. Sometimes you see a little gang of ants will be following the leader, but it's hard for more than one to remain attached, so to speak. Usually the extra ones will get lost and fall off. So it's rare to have more than one ant get led all the way to the new nest.
So wouldn't this be less efficient than just laying down a pheromone trail?
It looks remarkably inefficient. I mean, you watch them, it's almost frustrating to watch because, they often get lost and the paths are very winding and, it looks like a very inefficient way to tell one ant about another location. Yeah, why not just lay a trail? But we think there's good reasons why they use this inefficient method. One of them is that, these are small colonies and so they don't really need to move a lot of ants really fast, right? There's only a couple of hundred ants in there anyway. The kinds of ants who rely heavily on chemical trails usually have, colonies with thousands of ants in them. But I think there's a more interesting reason why tandem running might be good. And that is that you don't want things to be too efficient. So, if the recruitment was too efficient, then what you might end up doing is as soon as an ant finds any nest, and lays a trail to it, then in very short order, the entire colony will move there if the trail is too efficient. But maybe that wasn't a very good nest, right? Maybe there was actually a much better nest that, not far away that the colony could have found if they hadn't moved so rapidly into the first thing they found. So sometimes it makes sense for the colony to take it slow, invest some time, and in that way discover more options, analyze more options, and ultimately end up with a better decision.
So how does a worker or a scout ant go about measuring the quality of a potential nest site?
Yeah, that's one of the things that we probably know less about than some of these other features. So if you watch an ant inside the nest, as I said, they spend a lot of time in there. They wander around a lot. They make frequent visits. They go inside the nest and then back outside and inside again. They spend a lot of time near the entrance, and we assume that they're doing that because they are trying to see how large the entrance is. One thing we've learned is that the colonies care about some features more than others. They're very, very concerned about how big the entrance is. So a big entrance is bad news. And we assume that's because it's harder to defend. They have a lot of enemies. Maybe it also makes it harder to keep the internal nest environment at an ideal kind of status. But they do care a lot about the entrance. I would say the most obvious thing in terms of how they do assessments is that they care also a great deal about the light level. So when they're inside the nest, if they're inside a natural nest, like a rock crevice, it's really dark in there, right? Because it's made out of rock. The only way light gets in is through the entrance. So if you're in a crevice and it's very dark, that means that it's got nice solid walls that don't have a lot of holes in them, and which is undoubtedly a good feature in the nest. It's very clear that when they're inside the nest, they're partly just using their eyes to measure how bright it is. And the brighter the light, the less they like it.
So could a scouting ant adjust its behavior and how it interacts with other ants to recruit them back to a nest according to the quality of that nest? Is there some way they can gauge that?
It's interesting. So we've looked at a lot of details of their recruitment behavior to see, is there something different? Does an ant who's found a good nest recruit differently compared to an ant who's found a not so good nest? And in general, it doesn't look like it's different at all. It looks like once they decide they're going to recruit, they just recruit in a standard fashion. Like they do a tandem run as best they can. Now, there may be some subtle differences that we haven't detected yet. There's a little bit of evidence maybe that they're more likely to get lost, for example, if the site isn't as good. But the only thing that's the really major difference is just the difference in whether they start recruiting at all. If the nest isn't very good, then most of the time a scout goes into it, she'll end up leaving without bothering to recruit to it. If it's very good, then she will have a high probability of going back home and recruiting nest mates. And if it's kind of intermediate, then she'll have an intermediate likelihood of going back. So they kind of code their judgment of how good the nest is in terms of this probability that they start recruiting to it.
Would you say that ant colonies behave like a democracy?
Yeah, if you compared it to say, sometimes people talk about in animal behavior, they talk about despotic societies in which there's a single animal, like, for example, in some mammalian societies where there's a dominant male or a dominant female, and that individual more or less determines what the rest of the group does, like in terms of, where it goes to feed or where it sleeps, etc. Ants are not like that, right? There's not like a single, ant who gets to order everyone else to do, what that ant pleases. Instead, a large number of ants get input into the outcome. I would hesitate a little bit to call it a democracy for the reason that that kind of a democracy to me implies that the ants might have different interests and different desires and different best outcomes, and that they somehow come to a compromise or a majority rule decision about whose interests are going to win, right? But I would say that at least for the ants that we study and the problems that we study, generally speaking, the ants are in agreement. They all have the same interests. They all have the same goals in mind. Everybody basically wants to find the best nest, and everybody wants to make sure the colony moves as a whole to just that one nest and doesn't split. Mm-hmm. So in some sense, they don't really have the same need to sort out conflicts of interest that you might find in a human democracy. Now, of course, that isn't necessarily true. I could be wrong about that. There's many people who study social insects, and their main interest is, in fact, potential conflict and potential disagreements or differences in interests, especially about who gets to reproduce. But I would say that for the kinds of problems I study, there isn't a lot of conflict of interest. And so there isn't as much of a need to kind of resolve differences of opinion.
So no one ant wants to promote its potential nest site over the potential nest sites that are chosen by other ants.
Well, let's say it does, but only our assumption is, and the evidence generally supports this, our assumption is that its reasons for doing that, if it picks if one ant is advertising the nest it's found very vigorously, it's doing that because it is judged that nest is good for the colony, rather than say that nest is good for her, that one ant, but not necessarily for the rest of the colony. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, they're kind of selfless.
Okay. So as far as decision-making goes within an ant colony, it sounds like it's a combination of ants acting independently, but also relying on information they get from other ants. Is that correct?
I think that's a good way of putting it, yes. So if you go from a single ant's point of view, yeah, you can basically divide up her experience into the things she detects directly herself. Like, for example, she's found a nest and she can tell for herself how good that nest is. And then the indirect cues she gets about what her nestmates are doing. And that would be, for example, following a tandem run takes her to a new location or something like that. Yeah. So it's a mix of individual information and social information.
So your lab has published research that shows ant colonies are better at making complex choices as a group than as individual ants. Can you explain what that means?
Yes, that's something, sometimes people talk about the wisdom of crowds. That if you take a bunch of, say, not very skilled or informed individuals and you combine them together to solve some problem, that they will come up with a better solution than any one of them could on their own. There's evidence of that in humans in different settings and in other animals, and we've also found evidence for it in the ants. So, for example, if the ants are highly social. Really, they almost never do anything except in a social context. But it turns out you can take an individual ant out of its colony. You can put it in a nest box all by itself, and you can actually give it the same problems to solve that we normally give to entire colonies. So basically, you can have a single ant do all the work of choosing between two nest sites and deciding which one is better. And they can do that. They're actually pretty good at doing that, even if they're all by themselves. But what we've learned is if you make the problem more difficult, and one way you can do that, for example, is just take two nests and make them more and more similar in quality, right? So if one nest is really much better than the competing nest, it's pretty easy to figure out which one is better, right? But if they're very close in quality, it can be much more difficult for an individual to know which one is better. And what we found is that individual ants, if forced to solve that problem all by themselves, are not very good at it. But you can give exactly the same problem to the entire colony, and the colony is excellent at it. So basically, there's this increased ability to perceive differences in quality that the group has compared to any one ant by herself.
Well, Stephen, thank you so much.
It's my pleasure.
That was Stephen Pratt, Associate Professor at the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University. Up next, we have Simon Garnier, an Assistant Professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at the New Jersey Institute of Technology.
Science for the People is a weekly radio show and podcast that explores everyday life from a scientific perspective. We are a member of the Skeptic Network, a collection of blogs, podcasts, and video content focusing on science and critical thinking. To find out where Science for the People airs near you, or to listen to past episodes, check out our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. You'll also find links to support us at Patreon, to connect with us on Facebook and Twitter, and to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Science for the People. With me now is Simon Garnier, Assistant Professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. Simon, welcome to Science for the People.
Hey, hi. It's a pleasure to be here.
So tell me about the Swarm Lab and the kind of research you do.
Well, we are an interdisciplinary lab, meaning that we are using tools coming from very different disciplines, from physics, mathematics, and biology in particular. And we use all these tools to study how large groups of insects, animals, human beings, how they coordinate their activities, and how sometimes this coordination goes wrong, and how sometimes it goes very well.
What your research is about is something called swarm intelligence. So could you explain what that phrase means?
Yeah, so swarm intelligence is the idea that under certain circumstances, groups of individuals or animals will be able, when they work together, when they cooperate, to achieve greater outcomes together than they could achieve if they were just by themselves. So it's the idea of that there is an intelligence above the individual, intelligence of the group, that allows the group to solve problems that no individual by themselves would be able to solve.
So you're saying this phrase implies that animals that form swarms behave more intelligently as a group rather than as individuals.
Yes, it happens that in some circumstances, some animal groups can be smarter together than they are when they are by themselves. And conversely, some very smart animals like human beings, sometimes as groups, are less smart together than they are when they are left alone.
So is there or are there particular characteristics about certain kinds of animals that makes them do better in a swarm or in a group compared to when they are just solitary?
Well, so typically, I guess the most common example of animals that behave in groups in a very, very smart way are social insects. Mm-hmm. So you can think of ants, termites, bees, honeybees in particular. And one of the characteristics of these groups is that all the individuals inside these colonies, they tend to have lost some form of individuality. They tend to work essentially for the good of the colony rather than for their individual benefit. And when this kind of cooperation levels is achieved in a group, evolution will in general push these groups toward a very high level of cooperation and the ability to essentially produce as groups very, very smart behaviors.
So you specifically use ant colonies to study mm-hmm. this group coordination and behavior. So why did you choose to use ant colonies to do this?
Well, ant colonies, ants in general, right? They sort of represent the pinnacle of social evolution, in the sense that, so they're part of this class of animal that we call eusocial, eu meaning true mm-hmm. in Greek. So they are the truly social animals. Meaning that from the evolutionary point of view, they are even more social than human beings. And the reason for that is that there is in these animal groups, you have division of labor, meaning that each ant is going to be doing some of the tasks in the colonies, but there's also division of labor or division of reproduction. Only some individuals will carry on the reproduction for the rest of the colony. And this is something that essentially mark the last steps toward becoming social, is when most of the individuals in the colony essentially give up their ability to reproduce, the ability to transmit their own genes, in order for another individual in the colony to do that. I don't know if I make it clear, but essentially all the workers in an ant colony, they work for the reproductive individuals. They work for these individuals to be able to transmit their genes. And they've given up the right, or not the right, but they've given up the possibility to reproduce themselves.
So would you consider that to be an altruistic behavior, giving up your ability to reproduce in favor of the survival of the colony as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, it's the ultimate altruistic behavior from an evolutionary point of view, right? Because you will not have yourself a descendant, right? So that is essentially, I mean, you can't be more altruistic than that.
So would you say this kind of altruistic behavior is necessary for a social group of animals to be successful?
No, it's not necessary at all. Most social groups are not eusocial, so most social groups haven't reached that point. Like human beings, we are social species, and everybody in the population is capable of reproducing if they choose to. So it's not a necessary condition for cooperation to evolve. It's not necessarily a condition for social life to evolve. However, once it has evolved, once you have reached this level of sociality, it means that essentially you have a very reduced risk of competition within the colony. Essentially, individuals will not be competing anymore with each other to transfer their genes to the next generation. They will all work together so that one individual or a small group of individuals within the colony become capable of transmitting their genes. So essentially, it reduces strongly the amount of conflict that you'll have inside the society, which will make it easier to sort of make function.
So tell me about the species, the kinds of ants you use to study group coordination.
So there are like 14 or 15,000 different species of ants, and they all have very, very different social organization. In my group, we focus on, essentially, we don't necessarily care so much about the species of ants. We care mostly about the type of behavior they're capable of achieving. And the two main questions that we're exploring at the moment with ants is, one has to do with how they build things together, and in particular, how they use their own bodies to build structure that will protect them during their lives. And the second question is about how their supply chains work. So how do they manage to, make sure they have enough food for the colony to survive throughout the year? How do they shape their communication networks? How do they shape their transportation networks in order to make sure that food is always available and the colony can function properly? So for the first question that has to do with construction, we study a species of ants, or two species of ants in Panama. They are called army ants. They are from the species Eciton burchellii and Eciton amatum. And these two species of ants have this particularity that they are nomadic. So unlike most ants who, dig up a hole in the ground, fortify their nest, and just never move from that particular location, or rarely move from a particular location during their lifetime, these ants, they move almost every day. Every day they move from one location to another, and then during the day they hunt from that particular location, and then at night they pack up, move a few hundred meters away, re-establish a colony there, hunt again the next day, etc., etc. And what's fascinating with these ants is that in order to achieve this nomadic lifestyle, they have developed a bunch of behavioral adaptations that allow them to build temporary structures out of their own bodies. So they can build bridges and ladders along the way, which allow them to overcome obstacles along their migration trails. At the site that they decide to stay at every day, they build a structure which is called a bivouac, which is a sort of like football-sized blob of ants all attached to each other. It's literally what it is. I mean, it looks like a blob of ants. And they all attach to each other, and they use this structure to essentially protect the brood and protect the queen from the environment. And then every day or every night, this structure can dismantle, move a few hundred meters away, and then reassemble at a new location. And that particular behavior is like particularly fascinating because it's unlike anything else we see in ants, and it has a lot of potential application for like the development of a new generation of robots, for instance, that will that will be capable of essentially of forming structure that conform to any sort of environment that they find.
The fire ants, they make that kind of blob-shaped structure as well when there's flooding, right?
Mm-hmm. So fire ants is another species of ants that also form structure out of their own bodies. What fire ants do, we don't study them, but there's a fantastic lab in Georgia Tech, the lab of David Hu, that studies them very, very nicely. So what they do is when they're, the place they live gets flooded very regularly. And so they have this adaptation where when water comes, they sort of, they form these rafts by attaching to each other. And this raft essentially can float over the water for several hours or even days until they can reach another patch of dry land and then rebuild their colonies from there. So there is many examples of social insect species and ant species that are capable of forming structure out of their own bodies. What makes the army ants really, really special is that they do this every day. It's not because of particular life circumstances. They have to do this every single day. So they've really evolved specialized behavior to be able to form this structure small. We can have structure that are just, 5 or 6 ants to structure that are 100, 200,000 of ants. So they are capable of forming structure over this really wide range of conditions and size. But yeah, you will find, you can see if you look at honeybees, for instance, honeybees, when they swarm, they form this sort of like blob of bees attached to a branch usually, while other bees are looking for a new nesting site. That's a form of what we call living architecture. But it's done in one particular condition during their life, which is when they have to swarm. So they have to leave the safety of the nest to find a new nest site. Army ants do this on a daily basis at all scales and in pretty much all environments that they encounter.
So can you explain how the army ants work together to make these living constructions?
Yeah, I mean, it's the funny thing. It's not been studied a lot. There's been a lot of description of their structure in the literature, but except for a few studies over the past 10 years, not many people have looked into how they form this structure. So we are still really at the early stages of understanding how they do this. What we know and what we have studied so far in relative details is the bridges they form along their trails. So you have to imagine, so it's in the tropical forest. The ground is not really smooth and flat. It's a lot of ups and downs, a lot of gaps that they have to bridge. And these ants have sort of developed this behavior where they can form bridges in between, across gaps in order to essentially smooth out the terrain for the other ants moving along the trail. And what we think happens is as soon as they reach an area where there is a gap, essentially the ants that have to go down the gap slow down, which allow other ants to walk over them. And that's the signal for the ants if you want to stop and start trying to figure out a way to bridge that gap. So essentially it's if you have to slow down and then someone walks over you, it's a signal for the ant to stop and then try to find a way to attach yourself to something else in order to try to bridge the gap. Now, if you repeat this, that's for one ant, but if you repeat this for multiple ants and they start attaching to each other, they will start forming these bridges. And these bridges are not like stable structure. They are structure that are dynamic. They keep changing over time. They keep being remodeled. They can even move over time. We've shown that the bridge of the ant is going to be moving over time to try to find an optimal position. So sort of like bridge, find the optimal location where to put a bridge in the environment. And these structures are going to be extremely reactive to traffic. If there's a lot of traffic on the trail, then the structures are going to grow with the traffic. And as soon as the traffic is interrupted, the structure is going to dismantle itself. So essentially, if the structure is needed, it's going to build itself. And if the structure is not needed anymore, it dismantles itself. So it's pretty fantastic, right? It's like it's a bridge on demand. It's literally what it is. And that allow them to roam the forest, the tropical forest at very, very high tempo. I mean, some of these guys have been measured at something like 13 or 14 centimeters per second, which is about like 14 times their body length. I mean, it's like you have an army of Usain Bolt running through the tropical forest, and then every time there is a gap somewhere, all these Usain Bolts attach to each other to form a bridge, allowing the other Usain Bolts to run even faster across the forest. And that makes them extremely, extremely efficient in this environment that is both extremely adverse to movement and also completely unpredictable for them, because it's not like they can predict what the terrain is going to look like every day, because every day they move to a new location.
So it's kind of hard to imagine how the ants figure out how to fill gaps by creating a bridge. So does it work like this, where you have, say, a gap between two surfaces and there's water between the two surfaces? Does one ant start to make a bridge at one point and then another individual climbs on top of that individual and then you have another one on top of them, kind of like, a cheerleading pyramid? Or do you have ants coming in from both sides of the gap and then coming together at the center to form a stable bridge? Yeah,
so the most complex bridges, we think they are formed from a position where two objects intersect with each other. So imagine you have two branches intersecting with each other, meaning that the ants can follow one branch, and then jump on the next one, and then follow the other branch back. So when you have this sort of structure, it's a bit hard to describe with words, but if you imagine this sort of like triangle, sort of like triangular shape formed by these two branches, at the tip of the branch, ants were always trying to shortcut as much as they can. An ant is going to essentially step into this gap at the tip of the intersection, and then other ants are going to be walking over it. So it's going to form a tiny little bridge. But then by walking over it, they shortcut a little bit that deviation, and it sort of allow them to walk over to increase the size of the chain, essentially. So they can attach to each other to increase the size of the chain. And then once the chain is increased, the chain can move down this sort of triangular shape, and then move to sit in place at a location where two ants could not actually bridge directly the gap. I don't know if it's really clear what I'm explaining. It's really hard without images to explain what's happening. But it's essentially what they're doing is they start at a location where an ant or two ants can bridge the gap, and then other ants join in the chain, and by joining the chain, they allow the chain to move to a location where the gap will be even larger, and then other ants can join, which allow them to move at a location where the gap will be even larger, etc., etc. So it's a moving and growing chain of ants that then can end up at a position where it's completely suspended in midair. And so if you just arrive at the location and you just see the chain suspended in midair, you can't know how they're building this, because it looks like it's built out of nothing, because no ant is long enough to reach out to the other side. And it's literally what they do is they start from a position where they can bridge and then make this chain that increase in size and then move along the gap, and try to find like an optimal position along that gap.
So for the ant colonies have these different castes, like you've mentioned before. So you have the workers, the soldiers, you have a queen, you might have multiple queens. So, but for the case of the ant colony, the queen does not actually give instructions to the other workers as to what they should do. So in the process of, say, making a bridge with the army ants, you don't have the queen kind of standing there telling them how to make the bridge, right? So would you say that the coordination of ant colonies works best because there is no one individual who is in charge?
Yes. So the way it works is exactly what you say. There's no one in charge in the colony. We call the queen just because it's the biggest individual in the colony, and it's also the one that's in charge of doing all the reproduction work. But the queen doesn't give instructions to the workers. It's the way it works is very decentralized. It's what we call a self-organizing system. So it's a system in which the organization emerges from the multiple and repeated interactions between all the individuals in the colony, and not because there is some sort of pre-established plan or some sort of hierarchy or some sort of magical being that organize the action of everybody in the colony. So in this sense, it's very different from the way we human beings tend to understand organization. We tend to like or to create organization that is very hierarchical, very pyramidal, where there's someone at the top and then instructions sort of flow down from the top of the pyramid, and then information about the state of the activities flow back up the pyramid. The problem of this type of organizations is it works very well if you have small groups. It tends to become extremely difficult to maintain and extremely difficult to steer one way or another once the organization becomes too large. And this is even more true when you think of social insects and ants in particular, because these individuals have like very tiny brains, like 200 or 300,000 neurons at most. And therefore, you can't really imagine that there's a single individual in that colony who will be capable of having the cognitive abilities to sort of organize and like plan the activity of everybody. So that's one of the first problems. The second problem is once you have these very large organizations, communication becomes a real bottleneck. Because it becomes very difficult for one single individual to send in orders to everybody at once, and then for this particular individual to also receive feedback from all the rest of the colony or the rest of the organization. So instead, what they use is a decentralized mode of functioning. This idea that if you react appropriately to the behavior of the individual around you, and then you have this sort of cascading effect. So I do something that makes you more likely to do something, the same thing that makes someone more likely to do the same thing, etc. That's a very powerful means of organizing a group without requiring any centralization of information or any planification.
Do you think that even with this decentralization, that it could get to be more difficult to coordinate with more ants within a colony? Does communication break down at a certain point?
So that's that's where there's a sweet spot, right? In terms of the how this system functions. There are conditions in which the range of communication that you have and the type of reaction you have to the behaviors allow you to scale up the colonies to very, very large sizes. I mean, some colonies of leafcutter ants can reach something like 20 million individuals inside a single colony. A colony of army ants, some of the largest one are 2 million individuals, and then these guys have to move through the forest and migrate every day. So you can, under certain conditions, have self-organizing mechanisms that are capable of scaling up very, very efficiently at very, very large sizes. Now, what it requires like very good and very specific type of communication, and again very specific reaction to the information you get through this communication. Now, what ants use mostly for communication is, they use many different kinds of information, but the two dominant ways are chemicals, so pheromones that they use to organize their work, and also tactile stimuli. So ants are going to touch each other and smell each other a lot. And they're also going to leave traces in the environment using pheromone, but also by modifying the structure of the environment. And this two sort of mechanism, this direct tactile communication and this sort of long-lasting traces in the environment will allow the colony to organize itself both very efficiently at a very local dynamic level, but also over very large scales.
All right. So you also conduct research on swarm robotics in your lab. So can you explain what these robots look like and what they do?
So I used to. I do not do a lot of robotics anymore. Though I collaborate now with roboticists. So my lab focuses mostly on the biology side and on the modeling of the systems. And then we collaborate with roboticists, essentially to develop new strategies to organize the work of groups of robots. So the principle behind the swarm robotics, the idea is that we have two options when we build robots. We can try to build them as smart as possible and as complex as possible so they can do everything. And the problem of this strategy is it's extremely costly. And if, because it's costly, you can only build a limited number of units. And if one of these units fails, then, well, you've lost a lot of money. And then, whatever task you're trying to achieve is going to become, extremely difficult because you've lost your robot. So some robotics take the completely opposite approach. The idea is to build as many, standardized units as possible. So we can have like very low cost of productions. And we want to have them as simple as possible. So we can build as many as possible. Now the problem with that approach is that you end up with very stupid robots, tiny robots, that are capable of very, very little by themselves. And so that's where, if we can use ideas from swarm intelligence, we might be able to design algorithm and mechanism of organization. We can take all these stupid little robots and have them work together to achieve smart or smarter outcomes. And so during my PhD, in particular, I worked a lot implementing algorithms from ants in particular, but also cockroaches, in tiny little robots called Alice, to show that we were capable of, with these stupid robots, having them work together to find like the shortest path inside a maze. So you can imagine like you're trying to find what is the shortest path to access some sort of resource in the environment, or if you have a collapsed building and you want to find the shortest path to reach a person that's under that building, instead of using, you cannot send a big complex robot in that, but you can send an army of tiny little robots that by working together will be able to find the path to that particular person and also find the fastest path to get to that person. And so that was the motivation essentially behind this work. Now, currently we're working with people at Harvard, Radhika Nagpal at Harvard and Mike Rubinstein at Northwestern University, who are both roboticists, and we are interested in how we can use robots, how we can make robots attached to each other essentially to build this structure, but structure that can be built in any conditions essentially, because one of the problem of construction, human construction, is essentially we have a sort of like Lego stacking approach to things, where we have like a very standardized bricks and then we put them on top of each other. And the problem of this kind of structure is that they can't reconfigure themselves if the environment changes. They can't be built anywhere. We have to sometimes prepare the terrain before you can build something. The idea would be here to have sort of like smart bricks, if you want, that can attach to each other and then build themselves into any sort of configuration, any sort of object that we want in any conditions that we throw at them. And so with this roboticist right now, what we're working on is trying to understand the behavior of the army ants. How are these individuals who are, not super smart, almost completely blind, who only rely on tactile and chemical communication and like very simple form of that. How are they capable of forming these structures that are compliant to many different environments? And how can we use what we understand from these ants and then port these behaviors to robots? So these two people work on developing the robotic side. I work on trying to understand what the ants do, and then we meet in the middle at the modeling stage, right? We build together a computer and mathematical model of what's happening. And that's sort of the mathematical model or the computer model is a sort of the translation between what we understand from the biology and what we're capable of doing with the robots. And we can then translate the language of the ant into the language of the robots and vice versa.
Well, why would you use robots to study army ant colony behavior? Why not just stick with the actual ant colonies?
Well, it's very hard to study ant colonies in the field. You have to go out, you have to find them. It's really difficult sometimes to even get access to some of these ants. We spend sometimes like 2 or 3 months in the field, and then we come back with maybe 10 experiments, 10 replicates. So that's a lot of time, that's a lot of money that's invested in trying to understand how they work. Robots, on the other hand, can be, to some extent, manufactured relatively quickly, and they can help us figure out like proof of concepts of our theory about the ants. Right? The idea is if we have a mechanism general enough that it works in robots and that it looks like it works in ants, then we can say we have understood something about how biological systems are capable of building themselves up. So the idea is that the robots are here as a physical proof of concepts of our theory about how the ants are functioning.
Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure.
If you want to learn more about Stephen Pratt or Simon Garnier, you can check out their links in social media on our website at www.scienceforthepeople.ca. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week on Science for the People.
Science for the People is produced by Rochelle Saunders and edited by Ryan Bromsgrove. Helen Quivalon is our publishing liaison. We get research help from Josh Witten and consulting support from Desiree Schell. Our frequently seen guest hosts are Marion Kilgour, Anika Hazra, and Jessica Yaros. Our theme song is called Binary Consequence, and it was written and recorded by Fractal Pattern. Science for the People is entirely listener-supported. You can find us on Patreon, where you can support us with monthly donations in any amount, or you can send us a one-time donation in any amount via the donate page of our website. Science for the People is created in partnership with the Skeptic Network, a collection of blogs, podcasts, and video content focusing on the intersection of science, popular culture, politics and social justice. You can find out more about Skepchick at skepchick.org. The show is hosted by science news writer Bethany Brookshire and me, Rochelle Saunders.